Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, April 4th, 2024. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
Today, at some point, President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu will speak on the phone, at which point I assume that President Biden will express his outrage at the tragic attack on the food convoy that is the latest effort to find means, aside from the attacks of October 7th, to characterize Israel's efforts in Gaza as some form of colonizing, genocidal war crime. And as we said yesterday, we remain in this condition of sheer administrative gaslighting on the part of the executive branch of the United States, which has the president condemning Israel while arms are flying off the shelves to Israel to continue fighting the war in Gaza. And his own spokesman at the White House, John Kirby, says, well, obviously this was an accident. People in positions of high cultural authority, like Jose Andres, the chef who is behind the World Food Kitchen NGO effort, have all but said that Israel deliberately targeted the 7 aid workers for murder, which is a position that is so deranged that you can either attribute it to his deep grief, which I'm not going to, or to a opportunistic claim of martyrdom for the purpose of delegitimizing Israel's efforts. And the White House is continuing to walk itself into some kind of a ravine that is very hard to understand how it's going to get out of, which is that it is now saying that the country that it's backing is committing war crimes and murdering aid workers. So why isn't it changing policy? I don't want it to change policy. I'm happy with the policy. But I also don't think that Israel committed a war crime here. But Biden's saying that they committed a war crime. So it would sort of be incumbent upon him morally to shift his policy a little bit, right? Or is it just he's senile, he can say whatever he wants?
Well, he's not. He has not used the words war crime.
No, that's right.
No one in the administration has used those words.
Right.
I do think we got a preview of what might happen with the call between Biden and Netanyahu, with a call last night between our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, he's on the job, and Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. And there, the readout of that call from the Pentagon said that Secretary Austin expressed his outrage. He's outraged at the strike on the World Central Kitchen convoy, and Israel needs to immediately take concrete steps to protect aid workers and the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, because these efforts have been failing so far. And Gallant needs to conduct a swift and transparent investigation. And this is just reinforcing, the Pentagon continues, the Pentagon's concern, Austin's concern over potential Israeli military operation in Rafah because of the civilian presence there in Hamas's last redoubt. Those were my words. I expect Biden will have a similar conversation with Netanyahu. He'll talk about how angry he is at what happened. He'll say how outrageous it is. He'll say how this only means that Israel should wait longer before taking the fight to the final Hamas battalions in Rafah. And then the administration will believe that comment and that expression of outrage will be enough. to placate the anti-Israel left. But as we have learned, it is never enough to placate the anti-Israel left. And I fear that parts of the Democratic coalition are growing ever more wobbly in the Senate in particular.
So there was a meeting of Arab and Palestinian types at the White House, and apparently a couple of people walked out, and they said they walked out because they wanted to show Biden that what he was saying was nonsense, and they just wouldn't even begin listening to him. You're not supposed to have such meetings. Once again, as I mentioned the other day, this is a mark of how the advance team at the White House, this may be the worst advance team in White House history in terms of protecting Biden from the unexpected events, like creating news events where people can go on CNN and say, I walked out on the president because he is so heartless about the Palestinian people, when the meeting was staged solely and exclusively to try to make the point that Biden isn't heartless toward the Palestinian people and the people of Gaza.
This is very important, because this is something actually we've talked about many times with Biden's decision early on to make his whole shtick empathy. He did it on the campaign trail when he ran. He did it, even tried to do it after Afghanistan. His whole thing is like, I care, right? This is an example where that doesn't, when his policy making is doing one thing and his mouth is doing another. And so they had, I think it was in the Post or the Times, did a story about interviewing a bunch of Arab activists. There was one from the Arab Center who said, look at his hypocrisy. He's Mr. Empathy, but he has no empathy for Palestinian civilians now. So he has created, by embracing this idea that he's, the empathizer in chief, which some of us never believed him to be, but was his whole thing. He then is not living up to it if the policy making on the other side is doing something else. And now he's being called out for it, not by anyone on the right, who always thought that was a manipulative tactic to take, especially for someone like Joe Biden and his personal history in the Senate, but because it doesn't work. He's being called out on his own side now. And I think there's some justice in that, because he's not that empathetic, and he shouldn't be pretending to be empathetic. He should be a little more realpolitik in this situation.
I mean, go ahead.
What he is foremost is fearful. You can hear it in the response to the walkout on him. He has said, or Jill Biden has said, they understand the frustration and wanting to send such an insulting message to the president. Because they understand the hurt. Hurt.
And Dr. Jill, according to the president himself, is with the demonstrators. The president said, the New York Times reports, that Dr. Jill has told him to stop it now. Stop the war, Joe.
Oh, that's
Just
right.
do it. Just stop it now.
Yeah. So the fear
and
that they're broadcasting. And
it's Dr. Jill. It's Chris Coons, his ally in the Senate. And there are forces in the Senate like Chris Van Hollen, the awful senator from Maryland, who is going to try to use upcoming weapons transfers as an opportunity to condition our aid to Israel and to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Israel. So Biden's incoherent policy of rhetorically slamming Israel at every opportunity and critiquing its tactics and trying to delay its showdown with Hamas in Rafah, combined with unwavering support behind the scenes, is buckling, because it's not sustainable in the long run. And if only this president would look up from whatever he's reading. Apparently he reads a lot, and all these briefing books, because he needs to get in the weeds before he curses out his aides and then yells and screams about whatever's frustrating him at the moment. And look at what Senator Fetterman is doing on social media. Fetterman had a tweet yesterday in the midst of all the fallout from the strike on the World Central Kitchen, where he says this is all Hamas's fault, and Hamas wants us to retreat. Hamas wants America to part from Israel. But Senator John Fetterman, a Democrat, says, I won't do it. And that's, I won't succumb to Hamas. And that's all the president needs to say, to align his rhetoric with his actions and actually galvanize public support, which is there for Israel. It just requires a leader who is out to lunch on his way to Delaware.
A couple of other things going on in the war and in Israel itself. People in Israel have been notified that they are to take care. Ramadan is ending. Israel struck this compound in Damascus, this Iranian compound in Damascus. There have been these drone attacks on the southernmost Israeli city of Eilat that have been harmless, but seem to have come from the east, from an Iranian proxy in Iraq. And there is fear that Iran, in its need to retaliate for the Israeli strike, may do something big and may itself attack Israel's body proper, not Hezbollah, but it itself with missiles or bombers or something like that. Shelters have been opened that have been closed since just after October 7th. And people are freaking out a little bit. Reservists are being called back up to duty. The Air Force reservists have been called up to duty in case they need to scramble jets to actually have some kind of a dogfight with Iran in the skies of the Middle East. I don't really know. And so in Israel proper, there is a heating up of concern. And we have reason to be concerned too, because if Iran does retaliate, and it should be said, by the way, that over the last couple of years, Iran's retaliation, the tit-for-tat retaliation system that we would assume would be in place, hasn't functioned that way. That is to say, we killed Soleimani, and they didn't do anything. Israel routinely has subterranean secret missions in which it goes in and screws stuff up in Iran. And publicly, Iran doesn't respond, unless you can say that the Hamas attack of October 7th is the ultimate response. But I don't think that's right, because a tit-for-tat response has to be in proximity to the original attack or the original offense. Otherwise, it doesn't read as deterrence, right? It doesn't read as, you do this, I'm going to do that to you, so don't do it a second time. That's what retaliatory responses are for. Anyway, we have reason to be concerned because the general thought is Iran's not going to unleash Hezbollah in the north. It's saving Hezbollah for something else. That would be a waste. And it may not really want to have a direct, confrontation with Israel of the sort that we're talking about. But there are soft sites all over the West. The most obvious are Israeli embassies around the world. And then synagogues, Jewish community centers, places that are, marked as Jewish in the West and in the United States may be fair game, or may be viewed as fair game, and may be under threat. So it's actually an anxious day that we're talking about here. It's better to be prepared than not prepared. Therefore, people are now allowed to be prepared, unlike October 7th, which was all based on Hamas gulling Israel into a false sense of security in a plan that took several years to execute brilliantly did the brilliant lulling and then did the brilliant attacking, in a monstrous way, but nonetheless, cleverly done.
Well, the Iran angle is important here because it just adds to this idea of Biden's incoherent Middle East policy. After Israel executed the strike in Syria, which took out basically the latest Soleimani, what did the American government do? It sent a back channel to Iran saying, we had nothing to do with this. Don't look at us. This was all Israel. And this is the same administration that recently signed this sanctions waiver, which will allow Iran to profit off oil sales. So what is it? Are we with Israel in this confrontation with Iran, which spills over from Hamas to Hezbollah to the proxies in Iraq and Syria to the Houthis to the nuclear program? Are we trying to still hold out the idea that we'll have some type of rapprochement with Iran after the Gaza war is concluded? The lack of clarity here only invites aggression from Iran, whatever form it may take.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that Matt's making because you can really look back and just see how this administration laid all the groundwork for this crisis, between essentially reversing the Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure on Iran, delisting the Houthis, attacking
delisting
Saudi,
them from the list
terrorist groups,
Right.
Going after Saudi Arabia, not as an ally, but in response to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, giving the Iranian regime $6 billion in exchange for American hostages or American prisoners. All of it really emboldened that whole side of this conflict. And then after all that, Biden thinks or thought that saying don't in response to don't jump in and provocate was going to somehow that was going to be the policy, not the years of economic and strategic mistakes that he made leading up to it.
And who did the Saudi crown prince recently talk to that we just found out? Donald Trump.
I think it's important also to note that there is a certain degree of merit in the radical argument against Biden coming from the left. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. So they believe that Israel is committing whatever word you want to use, genocide, they're whatever they're doing. It's the, monstrous war crime, whatever. And the Biden administration says Israel needs to do more to make Palestinian state, but is still sending arms and doing this and doing that and saying Israel has a right to defend itself. And then a clearly horrible mistake is made, and this convoy is attacked, and 7 people are killed. And this is what's going to trigger the crisis in the Israel American relationship, not the however many Gazans you want to think have been killed, or not the the disproportionate Israeli response to what happened on October 7th or anything like that. Like, really, 7 people? That's more important than 280 million Gazans killed, all of them under the age of 5. I think they have a point if you accept their argument that these things are not equal, that if the war is unjustified, it's unjustified because of the mass effect of it, not because of the micro symbolic effect of striking nice people who are just trying to give people food. And
right, they have a logical point.
I think it's monstrous and awful. But this goes to Matt's point about incoherence and Fetterman, which is Hamas is responsible for this war. Israel would not be in Gaza were it not for October 7th, period. Israel was at peace with Hamas on October 6th. Israel did not break the peace. Hamas in its charter says that its purpose is to murder Jews and hasten the end of Israel. Israel has gone to war in Gaza intermittently 5 times before this, since the disengagement, and going in, killing tunnels, destroying mobile missile sites, all of that. This is the 6th time they've gone in, and now here they are doing it again, and they have to finish. And the only moral argument in favor of Israel's actions isn't whatever thing Biden says, which is that Israel has a right to defend itself. It's that Israel was Israel was the victim of an unprovoked attack that killed and injured 5,000 people in 6 hours.
Well, that's why the passive, that's where the Biden administration's passivity is most clearly on display, when he's always saying over and over again, Israel has a right to defend itself. What he should be saying is, Israel was attacked, Hamas started a war, now there are consequences for war, and we need to get the hostages out, including the American hostages. This is the other, I know I'm harping on the empathizer-in-chief BS that Biden has been promulgating for years, but why isn't he talking about the hostages? Why didn't anyone mention that Hamas has yet again walked away from the negotiating table about a ceasefire, about hostages? They are not engaging in anything remotely like an organization that wants to end this war. On the contrary. And again, the framing of our administration is just, well, they have the right to defend themselves. Israel has the right to defend itself. That is completely milquetoast and completely out of proportion to what happened to the state of Israel on October 7th. It's infuriating.
Even more important than that, and adding to that, is the fact that Israel, through America, through Egypt, through Qatar, whatever, is and has been for weeks putting proposals on the table for extraordinarily unequal swaps for hostages. 800 Palestinian murderers, 2,000 Palestinian murderers for 30 or 40 people, not the entirety of the hostages, but just some. Israel has to do this for domestic reasons because, in Israel, the pain of the hostage families is being felt by everybody, and and everyone feels as if, as we say on Passover, it is they whose children are hostages in Gaza. And so Israel has to do this politically, but it's also doing it. It's been doing it, and Hamas is rejecting the deals, all of which involve ceasefires, by the way. Now, by the way, there's effectively a kind of ceasefire in place, so maybe Hamas doesn't have to do it, by which I mean Israel hasn't gone into Rafah yet. It is still fighting. It had the battle in Al-Shifa last week, the return to Al-Shifa, the drawing in of the Hamas fighters to Al-Shifa that Israel then killed and captured. But Hamas is kind of getting what it wants out of Rafah right now, which is that the 1.2 million Palestinians sheltering there function as a human shield. Everyone's saying Israel can't go in until it figures out some provision to get them out of harm's way. And so that's why I guess Hamas doesn't want to make a deal. But the simple fact of the matter is Israel is at the negotiating table with this genocidal force that wants to destroy Israel because it has to be. And Hamas is not at the table. Hamas is not at the table. It's being negotiated through Qatar, and messages are hard to get around or whatever. They keep saying it's going to take a while to get an answer because we can't reach Yahya Sinwar, the commander of the Hamas forces, or something like that. But I mean, this is where this all gets to. We're living in bizarro world. Israel was attacked. Israel has been spending a significant amount of its time trying to arrange for humanitarian aid to go into Gaza. Apparently not enough. That's what we keep hearing, is they're not doing enough. But that they're doing it at all is a goddamn miracle. That they're bothering to do it at all is a miracle. When does that happen during war? And they're trying to negotiate against their own military interest in order to get the hostages home, and Hamas is saying no. And there is a presumption in every statement by Biden and by Kirby and all that, that it is to be understood that Hamas is bad, right? Israel's right to defend itself. Hamas attacked on October. But that argument needs to be made and remade because people in the United States who are willing or have a willingness or have a possibility of hearing the Hamas propaganda in their ears and having their opinions formed by it need there to be a counter voice. And the counter voice isn't us. Fetterman's a counter voice, right? But Biden actually, for his own sake, should be making that argument in order not to have his own voting base turn against him on this central policy of 2024.
There is one place where Biden and the Democrats have been consistent, and that is their opposition to Bibi Netanyahu and the ruling coalition in Israel. And there are some developments on that front as well over the past 24 hours. After coming to the United States and being yelled at by U.S. officials, including the vice president, Benny Gantz, who's leader of the opposition, but also part of the unity cabinet.
He's not, we should say, he is not actually the leader of the opposition because his party has 8 seats. The technical leader is Yair Lapid, whose party won 24 seats, but he's the figure outside of Netanyahu that polls the best in a potential prime minister.
And he's in the unity government.
Yeah.
Gantz.
And in the war cabinet. And one of the 3 people in the war cabinet.
And Gantz, after his visit where he was embarrassed, after the Schumer speech where Chuck Schumer called for new elections and a change in government in Israel, Gantz yesterday called for early elections in Israel and a September election. What's interesting about this is it seems like just a sop to try to placate the Americans, because I don't think the chances of an election anytime soon are very high. Am I right about that, John?
Well, okay. So the Gantz thing is interesting because he does not have any power to sink the government. Without him, the government has 64 seats. He went into the government with his party. So in theory, the government now has 72 seats, even though he didn't bring his party in. There is some movement on the right. Someone named Gidon Sar says he's leaving the coalition. It doesn't matter. It's all, as they say, Narishkeit, because the only way that Bibi's government falls is if far-right parties pull out, the parties in the control of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. There is no other modality by which the government collapses and elections are forced. So what Gantz has basically done is say, hey, look, if the universe aligns properly, we'll do Rafah, we'll finish, and then there really ought to be an election. There ought to be an election, and it should happen. And I think morally and indeed politically, he is right. I mean, the people say there has to be an election to reckon with the things that happened that led to October 7th. And it's complicated because he's implicated, as is Bibi. Bibi was prime minister for 15 years, but there was 15 months between 21 and 22 when Bibi was no longer prime minister, and the prime ministership rotated, and almost the entire senior political leadership in Israel is kind of implicated in the disastrous refusal to see that Hamas was gathering steam to attack on October 7th. Therefore, an election is kind of an interesting moral moment because it's like, what do the Israeli people want to say about the failure of their leadership? I have heard people who are very on the right say, we need to win the war and then Bibi should resign. And what's more, he should resign and not run for prime minister again, because it's enough. He should take responsibility. The parallel is Golda Meir. So Golda Meir was prime minister of Israel in 1973, did not heed warnings about an attack from Arab countries. And then on Yom Kippur in 1973, the Egyptians and the Syrians struck, taking Israel by surprise. It was the worst war, most destructive war in Israel's history. And there was a commission of inquiry afterwards. And the commission of inquiry cleared Golda Meir, said that the fault lay on the army and the army's leadership. She was not to be blamed. And she won an election that next year and then resigned because she herself could not countenance remaining in leadership. Her own, first of all, she was sick. She had cancer. And second, it was insupportable. Like, she felt responsible. She could no longer serve as the country's leader, even though she won an election. So if Bibi were a man, a real man, he would actually either call an election and say, take me as I am. It's your time. It's your turn to choose whether you want to blame me for this or not. I am putting myself before you to allow you to make this judgment. Or he could just resign. He could say, you know what, this terrible thing happened. I said I was going to win this war. I won this war. I'm ending my political career having won this war. I apologize for the circumstances that led up to the war. I am proud of having led the country through the war and winning the war. And, history will be my judge or something like that. I don't think either of those options are going to happen because he is as nakedly political a creature as exists and will fight until he dies to remain in power. But the Gantz thing is nonsense. Gantz can't bring the government down. The only way the government is brought down will be related to issues that have nothing to do with the war. That's the savage irony.
Well, there's one issue, though, and that is the ultra-Orthodox conscription that is happening right now and being debated in the Knesset. And in that situation, if the ultra-Orthodox, who as of now are exempt from military service, if they are enjoined to begin serving, couldn't that cause some of the religious parties to leave?
No, so exactly, but that you could say that's about the war, and obviously, but this has been a political issue now for 20 years, so obviously it then flares up in a much larger way. But it's a domestic issue about Bibi doing what he can to take care of the needs of his own coalition that is leading him, and I'm sure, by the way, against his own deepest convictions. I'm sure he believes that the Haredim should serve. The only people on the planet Earth who think the Haredim shouldn't serve are the Haredim, their parents, and their political leaders. Everyone thinks they should serve. But it's become a kind of, it's this kind of litmus test issue almost, and so this would fit into my model that I just laid out of Bibi's two different, because one thing he could do is, and he's not going to do it because he's trying to snake his way through this somehow, but it's to say, I'm signing the draft law. We're going to pass the draft law. Haredim need to serve. And then his government can collapse, and then he would run for prime minister again, having let's say theoretically, won the war and passed the draft law. Now, can he get a majority without those parties? No. Can anyone get a majority with another set of party things? There's reason to think no. So he could again end up as a caretaker prime minister because no one's able to form a government, which would not be great because there's another war that's going to be fought. I don't think it's going to be fought now. It's going to be fought in December, but that's the war against Hezbollah.
So
just
moving to the United States and the political implications here.
Yeah.
On the one hand, at the macro level, I think we spent a lot of time talking about how the Biden policy and what I call the incoherence of it is hurting Biden. It's hurting him with the base of the Democratic Party. And we saw in this recent round of the Wall Street Journal poll, where Trump was leading in 6 of 7 of the swing states, that the Democratic coalition is fracturing young voters, minority voters, leaving the Democratic Party. Now, is that because they're disgusted with Biden's approach toward Israel? Who knows? But we also know that Trump's lead in Michigan is pretty big, considering, and it's been very consistent. And so we know, too, that the Biden administration thinks they have a big problem in Michigan. So that's the macro level. But at the micro level, at some of these congressional levels, again, the Fetterman example seems to be relevant here. And I know Christine has taken a special interest in the race to replace squad member Jamal Bowman.
Well, the race in which squad member Jamal Bowman is running in a primary.
I want to replace
for re-election.
Right.
It's a race. For me, it's a race to replace him.
Re-election primary June 25th in New York, largely in Westchester County.
Right. So Jamal Bowman is being, well, first of all, there's what Matt is referring to, just despite my longstanding dislike of the squad in general, a new poll, the pro-Israel group that's called the Democratic Majority for Israel, showed just how badly Jamal Bowman is doing in his district. George Latimer, who's a Westchester County executive, is ahead of him by 17 points right now. And you've seen a lot of endorsements. The Jewish Democratic Council of America has endorsed Latimer. Latimer has very high positive favorable ratings, 68%. Only 18% view him negatively. So he's someone who has been outspokenly pro-Israel, does not bring any of the additional baggage that Jamal Bowman has brought as a squad member, nor the personal baggage that someone like Jamal Bowman has brought. Let's not forget, this is the guy who notoriously pulled a fire alarm and lied about it to try to stop a vote. So, and incorrectly even trying to stop the vote because the vote was supposed to happen. His Democratic colleagues wanted it to happen. So, kind of a blundering fool of a congressman to begin with, but his views on Israel are terrible. So if we see, and he's not the only one, there are other local elections where Israel is becoming an issue for these congressmen, and Jewish groups have organized very well, including Democratic Jewish groups, to say, look, we need to be more outspoken about what we believe and what we want our representatives to be saying when they go to Washington and debate foreign policy. And this is all for the good. It's the same way that we've seen a lot of campus organizations and campus student groups, Jewish groups, really have to step up and start being much more proactive about defending their rights, about defending their safety. This is a continuing shift in how people who otherwise were like, we just want, we have our space, we do our thing, leave us alone, we don't want to engage in protest. The protest is constantly being brought to them now, and they have to respond. And I think these sorts of elections are going to show responses at the local level in some of these districts.
Matt, today marks the 75th anniversary of the signing of the NATO treaty. NATO, both at a high water mark and a low water mark. A high water mark because it has shown a degree of unity and purpose and determination, including changes in policy country by country to enhance its own internal defenses and export of defense technology in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which happened 2 years and 2 months ago. Even Ukraine is not in NATO, but the idea that there is a war on the European continent and that this is why there is a North American treaty alliance. So high watermark for NATO in that sense, renewed sense of purpose. It's not simply a kind of symbolic conjoining of nations with similar interests. It actually is engaged in fighting a war, the purpose of which is to expel an enemy from the soil of not to take over another country in Europe.
It has 2 new members as well, Finland and Sweden. So it has expanded its ranks since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is, as you say, is not a member of NATO, but the NATO alliance and its largest backer, the United States, has taken the lead in assisting Ukraine through foreign military sales to defend itself. So it's 75 years, and there was a time after the Cold War when NATO was searching for purpose. Even before the Cold War ended, there were intellectuals who thought that NATO was kind of a paper tiger. But I think what we've seen in recent years is that not only does NATO have a purpose, it's the most successful post-war multilateral institution. You compare NATO to the United Nations, which disgraces itself on a daily basis now. You compare NATO to the Bretton Woods Agreement that governed capital flows around the world, that fell apart in the 70s, right?
Yeah. The World Trade Organization, World Health Organization,
all of those
part of the UN. Yeah,
right. All of these organizations that were set up after World War II have become, if not irrelevant, dangerous to American security. Whereas NATO, which was established in 1947, is thriving. And I think the reason it's thriving, not only because the external threat is real, but also because there's a common sense of purpose and shared values among the members of the organization, unlike in the other cases where everyone was joined in this, was able to join in this kind of utopian vision that we could all get along, and very quickly was exposed as a farce because nations like the Soviet Union or modern day Russia and the People's Republic of China had a vote and therefore could control what the organization did or said. NATO is a league of democracies, and it is. There's some, with the exception of Turkey, but there was always a sense that NATO was a capital W Western organization, and that it stood for representative government and free markets and individual rights. And I think that is what's proving its strength, the reason for its durability, but also why it's so necessary.
And so, of course, there are voices inside the United States at this moment of
who despise it,
who despise it and want to destroy it. And there is a schizophrenia in Trump world, which is, of course, the Trump world or Trump adjacent world, which is the source of this NATO hatred. There's a weird gaslighting of the sort that we're talking about with Biden, which is the following. These people have decided that they don't like Ukraine. Ukraine is a dictatorship under Zelensky. He hates Christianity. I don't know what he's corrupt. I don't know, all this other stuff. I keep pointing out that Trump himself has never attacked Zelensky, which I think it remains a kind of startling thing because, of course, Trump will attack anybody for a hangnail, and he has never attacked Zelensky, and he has never come out in opposition to the policies that are in place, except to say that he would do everything better, or there wouldn't have been a war if he were president, or he can solve the war in 24 hours when he becomes president. And there, with NATO, what's interesting is he doesn't like NATO. He never liked NATO. I don't know why. He said they're not paying their fair share. He said, we're going to pull out because you all suck. And then suddenly NATO stepped up. First of all, in response to him, people started saying that they were going to increase their defense spending to NATO's required or, target of 2% of GDP per nation. And second, they're stepping up. So Trump running for president again, one of the things that he can say is, I made NATO great again. I made NATO work again. It wasn't Biden. It was Biden who pulled out of Afghanistan and then created all of this instability that led to the invasion of Ukraine. I did it. I made them start ramping up their defense spending. I made them start thinking again about the common defense of the West, how they were on the front lines and they were relying too much on us. and using us so that they could support their own welfare states and all of that. That's an issue that Trump could exploit. His base still wants him, doesn't like Ukraine, and still wants him to pull out of NATO. So it's an interesting, I don't think you hear this that much, but there are things. It's sort of like the vaccine. What's Trump going to do on the vaccine? The smartest thing for him to do is to say, America had among the best outcomes in the world. There's actually an interesting piece by David Wallace Wells in the New York Times about the COVID, about the international response to COVID and what nations did well and what nations did poorly. And you can take his numbers with a grain of salt or not. You can feel about the vaccine the way you would. His bottom line is that 3 million people lived in the United States who would have died were it not for the vaccine. Trump is responsible for Operation Warp Speed, which got the vaccine into people's arms beginning in the winter of 2021 after he had been booted from office. And again, so he's got this weird thing, which is he can say, I cured COVID. Biden screwed up the administration of the vaccine and let the crisis go on far too long. And I fixed NATO. But his base doesn't seem to want him to say either.
Well, he says the vaccine occasionally. I mean, he doesn't.
Occasionally.
Yeah. And
it's then not like the centerpiece of his speech.
But then he'll editorialize and say, some people don't want to hear that. Some people don't like that. But he doesn't fear the sort of Frankensteins that he's created exactly. It's that he sometimes agrees with them and sometimes wants to sort of soar above them and take credit for things that they don't recognize. But he's not, it's different from Biden's, as I said, abject fear of losing people in his base or around his base.
Yeah, and I think, Trump was zinged a few weeks ago for telling the story about how he threatened to let Russia do whatever it wanted to Europe if the NATO countries didn't increase their defense spending. The media took that story as saying, look, if Trump becomes president again, he's going to let Putin do whatever Putin wants to do. Trump used the story to say, this is how I got the Europeans to spend more on defense. And that's how I would probably do it again. I mean, so he does kind of understand that playing the part of the bully gangster is the way that he gets these allies to up their defense spending. And look, European nations need to do more. And that's going to continue to be an issue. The NATO, especially Germany, which still is resisting spending its quota for defense, despite the threat from Russia, which comes ever closer. But I think the major takeaway of this day is that the expansion of NATO around shared values and a shared sense that the West, broadly conceived, faces a threat from authoritarian powers has been a success, and it's worth celebrating, despite all the voices within the Republican Party, primarily, that have turned to an anti-NATO, really almost neo-isolationist view of America's role in the world.
So, Matt, we are facing a time of testing, a time of choosing, a hinge moment here. Congress comes back next week, and Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican, who is on a knife's edge because there is a kind of floating sword of Damocles, or there's a floating guillotine in the form of a congressional maneuver that could be executed against him by one member of Congress. Right now, that would be Marjorie Taylor Greene, to end his speakership. Johnson has made it clear that were he king of the world, or were his preferences to be met, he wishes to push through aid to Ukraine and aid to Israel. And I think aid to Israel is probably fine with most Republicans, so I'm not quite sure why. But the aid to Ukraine is the guillotine for him. And there is this question, which is how he has said things like, history will judge us all if we don't send aid to Ukraine. Like, he has basically said, like, I will be a moral failure if I don't get this done. Yeah, I didn't say it. He said it.
I think he intends to move some type of Ukraine aid onto the floor of the House of Representatives in April. It's very important that he do this because Ukraine is running low on ammunition and weapons platforms. It needs resupply, especially because it faces this huge manpower deficit, which plays to Russia's advantage. So I think Johnson understands that. The White House understands that. And what we've seen during this recess is Johnson floating various ways of perhaps attracting more Republican support. So he floated the idea of pairing the Ukraine aid with a reversal of Biden's ban on licenses to build liquefied natural gas export facilities in the United States of America. The White House kind of came out pretty strongly against that. He's floated the idea of pairing the aid with the Repo Act, which I've written about, which would allow the United States to seize Russian assets and repurpose them to aid Ukraine. That, I think, is broadly popular throughout the House and the Senate. He's going to try to look for one of these ways to get some cover from the Republicans. But at the end of the day, he may just be faced with the choice of having to move to suspend the rule, which would allow the Ukraine aid to come to the floor of the House with limited debate, as long as it's passed by 2/3 of the House. Now that would pass, but it would also be another example of this. What one person describes as a coalition government operating in the House, where the Republican majority, because of its narrowness and because of the presence of the Chaos Caucus, just can't get a lot done. And so Johnson, like McCarthy, has had to rely on Democratic votes. And when that happens, it's very likely that there will be some challenge to Johnson's speakership.
The greatest novel written about politics, in my view, is Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. And Phineas Finn comes to its climax as a young, idealistic member of the parliament who is 26 years old when this takes place, is put in a position where his party demands that he vote for something that he does not believe in. And he has a long, dark night of the soul about what this is going to mean for his ambitions, for what he wants, for who he is, for his social standing, his social position as a not wealthy guy who has gotten himself into Congress. And in the end, he has to vote his conscience. He votes against his party, is ousted from, ousted from the job that he gets that pays him a sufficient enough salary so that he can live in London. And he resigns from the parliament, goes home, and marries a nice local girl, and that's the end of the book. And in some fundamental sense, this is the dilemma that faces Mike Johnson. Not that he's a young member, not that he's this, not that he's that, but he's not a wealthy man. He has found himself in a position of real, genuine power, and he has told us that his conscience as a religious man, moral, whatever, is telling him that there needs to be Ukraine aid. And yet, what he needs as a person of power to remain in power is probably to accede to the blocking of Ukraine aid. And that's why this is a remarkable moment. So
here's my crazy scenario of the day.
Yes.
Not the rosy scenario, it's the crazy scenario. Johnson will call the roll, suspend the rule on Ukraine aid. It will pass. Marjorie Taylor Greene will move to oust him. The GOP, the anti-establishment or the Chaos Caucus Republicans will join in her. He'll be ousted. And then he will resign from Congress.
Yes.
Giving us the Jeffrey speakership before the election, as I have predicted for months.
I mean, it's like the hilarious thing that happened the other day, and then we can move on to your recommends, or happened the other week. When Mike Gallagher, the congressman from Wisconsin, decided that he was going to leave the House early, having said he was not running for re-election, but that he was going to leave the House early for personal reasons, Molly Hemingway of The Federalist wrote a tweet condemning him for his disloyalty because of the way he was reducing the Republican majority in the House. This is a person who opposes everything that Mike Gallagher stands for, who is, in her own person, Molly Hemingway, the reason in some fundamental sense that Mike Gallagher said, I'm not wasting my life doing this if this is what I have to face. And then she has the nerve and the temerity to attack him for disloyalty to the Republican Party, which has basically told him in her person it is no longer his party, and that he is to kowtow to her impotently rather than to be his own man and his own person. And that is one of the interesting, again, almost novelistic Trollope 6 novels about politics. The Palliser novels, the greatest political novels ever written, are chock-a-block with this kind of choice between, personal convenience, financial stability, political expediency. And, every now and then somebody comes along and says, I am just not playing your game anymore.
Mike doesn't have the same ring as Phineas, though.
Right. Yes.
The novel Mike Gallagher doesn't really flow as trippingly off the tongue as the Trollope.
That is true. Well, although he is Irish, and the subtitle of Phineas Finn is The Irish Member.
There you go.
So, should say. Anyway, Matt, what is your commentary recommends?
Thank you, John. This week we've been having a lot of new media recommendations, and so I thought I would follow the crowd as usual and recommend 2 YouTube videos. I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with the name Haviv Redig Gur, the columnist for the Times of Israel, a frequent guest on the Call Me Back podcast with our friend Dan Senor. And Haviv, who is just a very good writer, a very good person, delivered 2 lectures earlier this year at Shalem College in Israel. This is the liberal arts college in Israel, very small. And both of these lectures are available on YouTube, and I highly recommend them. The easiest way to get them is to just enter the words Haviv Redig Gur lecture on YouTube, or you can go to Shalem College's YouTube page, and they're displayed prominently there. The first lecture is called Israelis, the Jews Who Lived Through History. And it is, I think, just a brilliant and provocative argument about the differences between Israelis and the Jewish diaspora, primarily in America. And the second lecture is titled The Great Misinterpretation, How Palestinians View Israel. And it, too, is a very interesting, fascinating argument about the continued mistakes made by Palestinian elites about what Israel is, who Israelis are, and why Israel exists and why it must continue to exist. That one's a little bit longer, but if you do have time, and I know many people, almost listen to YouTube videos as versions of podcasts these days, it's worth checking out both videos. They're enlightening. Haviv, in addition to his many talents as a journalist, it's clear would make an excellent teacher, so he will hold your attention the whole time. And if you're like me, you will learn something as well.
Just so to simplify, by the way, I just did this, and if you go to the YouTube search window and you type in Haviv Gur, that's Haviv, and then the second word is Gur, and lecture, you can find it, and you could probably find it just by typing in Haviv lecture.
Right.
Haviv's, among many other interesting things about him, Haviv is one of the 2 people on this planet that I know of, son of American parents, grew up in Israel, but came and studied in America. His father got a job in Milwaukee. He did his high school years in Milwaukee and then went back to Israel. And he is one of two people. My nephew, Noam Bloom, who works at Tablet, is known to people as Neon Taster on Twitter, who are perfectly bilingual. In other words, like, he can write in English as well as he can write in Hebrew. He can think in English as well as he can write, as well as he can think in Hebrew. This is an almost unknown thing. So you are listening to somebody who speaks entirely idiomatic English with an Israeli accent, who has this extraordinary base of knowledge and sensibility, and is just very exciting to listen to. But he does have this quality of, he understands, he lived in America, lived in Israel, he's an Israeli, but he's also an American, and has a kind of bifurcated sensibility as a result that makes him uniquely perfect for this moment that we need the kind of explication that he can provide. So with that, we will say goodbye until tomorrow. For Matt, Christine, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.